Welcome to our question and answer portion for the PI podcast.
PI nyo.
I was expecting a bit more in there, but yes, PI nyo. the PI podcast inquiries, where we answer listener questions. And we have a very interesting question from our listener, our dear friend Eiffel. And so sabi niya, may topic suggestion ako about the political spectrum. What is left, center, right? Who are they? Why are they distinct, and why are they important, to preserve and destroy the status quo? Well, let's try to see the underlying question there is. It's actually, why is ideology important, or why is it important to study? I think that's what's underlying there. And relatedly, I think we can all, this is a very interesting question, very specific, but it's also been
very
somewhat
old.
ignored. Apologies for that. It's very belated.
Very belated.
What's your take or opinion on right-wing politics, i.e. capitalist, small government, from classical liberalism, modern conservatism, up to anarcho-capitalism? That's a very long question, which is probably why we put it aside for a while. But I think it's definitely related, because this is one whole section of the political spectrum. So might as well take them as a whole. So, Borj, what is ideology? And why is it important? What do you think?
So again, thank you for our listeners here. One of them is a friend who remains anonymous. He wants to remain anonymous. And of course, thank you to Eiffel for suggesting this one. This had been a long time on my messenger. So now we have found time to discuss ideology. Last episode, we discussed political science. So another task of political science is to examine the ideas shaping our behavior, shaping how we understand politics and how we respond to it. And again, why are we studying ideology? What is it? I think we need to start with the why first, because I think people have an understanding of what ideology is. So I don't think we are speaking we are speaking a foreign language here when I speak of ideology. But we'll go back to those definitions. But why is it important right now? Answer is simple. Because we are in a position of political maturity. We are seeing political values being consolidated in the Philippines. You may call it, toxic politics, people having very strong convictions on things. But for citizens to have strong convictions is a clear indicator that their sense of, their ideologies are solidifying. But for the longest time, ideologies have been ignored by scholars here in the Philippines. Been ignored for a long time because it had been associated with strong parties. So they have reduced ideology to strong parties, and since we don't have strong parties, for them we don't have strong ideologies. So now, in reasserting the importance of ideology, we need to define or revisit and visit more recent ones. We visit the classic ones, and we revisit more recent definitions of ideology to make it distinct from political parties. You don't need to have strong political parties to have strong ideologies.
Right.
And
although that is usually an indicator that people have political ideologies. People choose parties based on their ideology, how well it resonates with the party's ideology. So I think it's important, like you said, that political science and political analysts in general usually ignore ideology precisely because we don't, there's a lot of political butterflies. People switch parties all the time, and whatever. It's never really clear what parties are for. In the Philippines, it's usually just a bunch of clubs of rich people. It's not that. That's not, and it's no longer useful. But for the longest time, it's the old definition of ideology is usually the principles and policies and platforms of a political party. The piece there.
For the longest time.
For the longest time. But of course, there's another, perhaps almost equally, if not more, popular definition or conception of ideology, which is that of false consciousness. Do you remember this, Borj? Do you remember where this came from?
I think
it's the Marxists, right?
So I think we can do a rundown for our listeners trying to define what ideology is. So the idea of a false consciousness. Okay, so we'll start with Marx, because Marx was, of course, one of the first to study ideologies to give it proper consideration. So for Marx, from his work with Engels on the German ideology, so he defines ideology as the ideas of the ruling class and it is a false consciousness. So I think the first one would be quite self-evident. To call something as ideology is to refer to ideas meant to serve the interests of the ruling class. They are not only the ideas of the ruling class themselves, but these are ideas that are meant to preserve the power, the hierarchy of the ruling class. So ranging from ideas of the sanctity of private property to, political
Liberty.
equality as something thoroughly just legal. The legalistic notion of political equality is meant to preserve the status quo because it makes the ruling class impervious to illegal means of political equalization. So again, all ideas that are meant to serve the ruling class, that's part of an ideology.
Right, which it responds to like the second question, which is right wing. A lot of what the right wing is defined as that serves the interests of the elite or those who are comfortable. But that doesn't necessarily include the Marxists. The people wielding that critique.
I think
in a way, what they have is an ideology in themselves.
Counter ideology. So you have Antonio Gramsci looking at it as counter hegemonic struggle. So you cannot escape ideologies. All you need to do is to provide an ideology that is closer and closer to what reality is, an ideology that's closer and closer to progress. So we go back to the notion of false consciousness. So this is a bit of it's a controversial idea of false consciousness.
Right.
But I think the controversy stemmed from a misunderstanding of what false consciousness is for Marx. The ordinary understanding, when you say false consciousness, it means that the person is lying and that it's based on falsehoods or non-factual, conclusions.
Delusions.
Delusions. But for Marx, it's not only about that. That is the most brutish form of it. But for Marx, it's a bit more subtle. False consciousness for Marx is providing an incomplete picture of reality. Meaning you ignore specific yet vital components of a certain reality. That is false consciousness that you're providing. So for example, if you look at poverty and just say that people are lazy, then you are ignoring the fact that some people inherited poverty. So that's a false consciousness. Not because it is not true. There, of course, I will not discount the existence of lazy people who became poor, but it is not excuse. It's not an excuse to ignore the larger setting of inheriting poverty itself. So false consciousness, just to be clear, according to Marx, is about presenting a partial view of reality and claiming it as the
absolute
only
truth.
the absolute truth. So it's about partiality. So false consciousness is about that. Now, another definition which I would like to raise, which an elaboration by Louis Althusser. So Louis Althusser, psychoanalyst and philosopher. So basically, Zizek's spiritual father. For Althusser, he again elaborates on false consciousness. Okay, he elaborates on it, so he adopts it. But his contribution is to look at ideology as a claim of being natural, of being ahistorical. So an ideology for Althusser is any set of ideas, any system of ideas, visions or plans, proposals or whatnot, that is based on claims that something is natural or without history, meaning it had been there ever since and it would be there forever. So any ideology or any idea that claims that is it, then any claims to human nature, as far as I'm concerned, for Althusser,
it's always been that way.
That is the key word for that one. For Althusser, you would know that an ideology exists if you hear that word from people. That has always been that way. When in fact, if you look at history, ganyan talaga. So for example, the notion of private property as something sacred and natural, John Locke's idea, that's an ideology because private property is not a natural thing. It had always been a mixture of personal and collective property. So to say that one is natural is to ignore the entire violent history behind private property, especially the means of production and ownership of land. Okay. But then again, Marx and Althusser, you would have this, they have been combined with dogma, with other counter ideologies. So we have the most recent definition, which is by Michael Freeden, as far as my RL is concerned. So Michael Freeden provided a notion of ideology that to an extent tries to revive or recover the legacies of Marx, Althusser, and everyone else without descending into dogma, without descending into any claims for absolute truth. So for Michael Freeden, an ideology is basically a conceptual map. Okay? It's a map of important concepts that we use to understand politics, that we use to project a future for politics. So whenever we think of an ideal situation, whenever we try to understand politics, we are using a conceptual map. Okay? But what makes it ideological, this is what separates ideology from theory, is theories are also conceptual maps, you know.
Right.
But what separates it would be the contestation. So an ideology is an act of decontestation. When you say that this is it, this is the conceptual map, there's no need to discuss whether it is valid or not, because this is the truth. So this is what separates theory from ideology. So theories would always have a question mark. They would always entertain questions.
Right.
But for ideology, when it's transformed into an ideology, you say that, yeah, this is the truth. This is it.
But question, like, there is the old definition of ideology says that things are as they are and have always been this way. But with regards to Frieden's definition, would you think that ideologies are capable of changing or adjusting to the times?
And that's the thing. It would take theory to more or less reassert its importance. But ideologies can, Frieden situates it in a historical perspective, of course. Ideologies morph through time. But changes in morphology, changes in the form of or the content of an ideology would depend on, advances in theory as well.
So that's quite funny. Yeah, like we talked about, well, the first utterance of like ideology is is the accusation of it being a false consciousness of their enemy until they themselves become the ideology and false consciousness themselves, which is kind of hilarious. Whereas I think it, just to connect both Althusser to Freeden is Zizek. If you remember his quote in the Pervert's Guide to Cinema, he says that it uses the matrix. You need the blue pill and the red pill. One of you that says that to stay in the world of ideology or in the matrix, or you stay in the blue. Well, the red pill is like to escape, to escape from the matrix and see the truth. But in reality, he wants a third pill to see the truth within the matrix or within the ideology. In a way, it's in between Frieden and that false consciousness, because the things that we see as ideology, in a way, are I want to say the word authentic. I don't know why it's that, but in a way, it's real. But it's something that we enact. It's not necessarily false, but it need not be as they are. Like it needs to be. It needs to change. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think what you're trying to pin at is, well, for Zizek, sniff. I think what Zizek tries to pin down, again, he's a Marxist and he's closer to Marx, is that since ideologies are based on theory, that's a fact. Ideologies are all based on theory. It's theory solidified, and theory would always have a grasp of the truth, even if it's a partial one.
Right.
So ideologies would always have a partial truth in it. And to live in ideologies, to accept that ideologies would always have partial truths in it. It's not really an issue of who's right and who's wrong. It's an issue of who has a more complete picture. So to live in ideology is not to surrender to it, but to have an active grasp of it. And I think this is what Frieden invites in his succeeding works on political thinking itself, which is, we don't deny that ideologies exist. We have ideology. I have ideology. You have ideology. It's better that we are conscious of it, and it's better that we know who are the powers behind it, and it is better that we try to empower ourselves to try to shape it on our own. Meaning we always chase that whole truth. That's the absurdity of it. We cannot have the whole truth, but what we can have would be more and more complete pictures.
Right.
That's why conservatism now, or ideologies now, they're very different from what ideologies are before.
Yeah. I mean, if you see conservatism in the United States, they used to be anti-gay marriage. Now they're tolerant of it. They're not quite so that's the change in nature of it. They used to be censorious. They used to ban bad words. Now a lot of comedians that say bad words are politically conservative. They're for the freedom of speech, which is odd. So it's the changing nature of that side of American society and politics. So like what you said, ideologies are at the time, pictures are snapshots of society. They don't come out of nowhere,
Yeah.
but they become they become false when you try to preserve that picture or say that picture is true for all time.
Yeah.
Even in the future. That's basically it.
You try to slap it on other people's face. So that's basically the source of power for ideologies, because human beings have, well, we all have this unconscious need to have a grasp of the truth. And we need that truth to be unbending. So that is what ideologies, or that's what ideologues tap into. They satisfy that need to have a solid notion of truth. And regarding changes in ideology, I mean, Marx utilized religion, the Catholic Church, as the primary example of the primary example of an ideology or of an ideologue. But even now, Pope Francis's recent efforts in trying to absorb the LGBTQ community by saying that fine, we civil marriages are fine. He recently said that one, and the parents should be to love their LGBTQ children. So
now let's be careful, because a lot of people say it's out of context, so it's a dangerous person to quote, actually. But yeah, I think there have been all sides have adjusted. So even what the leftists call the bourgeois, or the capitalist class call the leftists, they're quite different. They have both adjusted and moved on. But because they move on, this doesn't mean that they're still, they're not ideologies. So that's one thing that we should figure out, which is if they're still flexible, how then should we analyze them now, considering that we've established they exist. They do change, but they still have a hold on people. What's the moving forward?
Moving forward, I think it's a combination of Freeden and Marx and Althusser. So Freeden is more sensitive to systematic analysis of values, concepts that we have, how we understand the world, how we look at the future, so on and so forth. So we must have a systematic analysis of the values and attitudes and ideas of citizens, ordinary citizens, away from political parties, regardless of political parties. So we need to separate that one. We can connect them back if the data warrants it. For example, sectors that are associated with political parties, probably they would have different notions of it. So we can go back, but we need to have a more bottom-up approach regarding this one. Another would be, again, this is something that we need to pick up from Marx and Althusser, is all ideologies would always forward power for a specific sector.
It's not for everybody. Not all. It's always a specific for specific people. Yeah,
it's not necessarily for specific people per se, but there's always a question of power asymmetry. So there's always an inequality of power behind all ideologies.
Yeah. So a single ideology usually prescribes power should be for the certain entity, individual, institution.
Yeah, for a specific entity. So we need to trace who are they empowering, who are they preserving in office,
who are they disempowering,
and who are they disempowering. So
so that's ideology, which is underlying. But I think let's not forget, of course, the original question, which is what is the political spectrum? So a political spectrum is a tool that political science use. You and I have used it for our class. You have to do the political compass.
Where are you?
It's actually, to be honest, that's the point I'm making. It's very difficult to hammer down. In fact, the political compass is a tool to measure ideologies in relation to each other, and in relation to, at least in the political compass, their relationship to authority and their relationship to change. So usually the right wing is it believes in the current structure and traditions, whereas the left wing usually believes in change. In change, in radical change, reform, whatever. The political spectrum differs from context to context. But what can you say about the political spectrum here in the Philippines? Is there anything particular about it? And especially with regards to the upcoming elections, is the political spectrum useful to plot the candidates right now?
If we would use the old spectrum, they would all end up near the center. That's why we need to, I cannot really answer that at this point, because we have yet to conduct a systematic understanding of it. But yeah, we're
Yes.
doing it with resilience, and I think we can have a axis on resilience and discontent. So instead of
Yeah.
so we can have an axis again. We need to reconstruct the political compass in order for it to be relevant to our case, because this is high time that we would have our own political compass. Because again, I think something that you failed to mention, the political compass, if you're familiar with the test, is a top-down approach. So you start with dogma, you start with doctrine, then you try to lay out the opposing sides of specific doctrines. That's why when I was, and another thing, you don't need to stay in one quadrant of it if you're an actual human being with brains. But
Right.
dati nasa ano, I was in the red quadrant, right smack above Stalin. Now I'm in the
Right.
libertarian one. Yay!
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay.
Ikaw nasa ka na ba?
That's character development. No, for the longest time, I used to be left of center because a lot of my friends were, and we were learning about, Marx. Yeah, Marx, Lenin. We learned a lot about Althusser and all that. But now I'm closer to right of center. I don't know. A lot of things happen. But yeah, you're right in that it doesn't measure you for all time. It's not a static identity. In fact, like a lot of quizzes that you take, they depend on the answers that you give, and our beliefs change depending on how we develop. So, yeah, I think that's part of being a thinking human being. Thinking is like for some people, thinking is a fancy way of just means you changing your mind, or yeah, or maturing in a way, depending on changes in the times. But yeah, and I think you're right. That's an interesting thing to say. That you said that in a way we should change this cycle, because if you notice, the political compass was made by Western scholars, particularly Americans, and even the sample political compasses they put like Hitler and Gandhi and Mother Teresa and Barack Obama. None of them Filipinos. In fact, you'd be hard pressed to easily put a Filipino in this compass.
Yeah.
So yeah. So you presented a possible way of contextualizing the political spectrum in the Philippines. I think it's necessary. A political spectrum is necessary in any polity, but it has to be derived from the specific context. So in a way, in order for us to do that, the PI podcast has decided to, in a way, create a series to try and explore these positions and these existing ideologies. Perhaps, of course, we begin things like, what is conservative, so we can continue this conversation. I think a lot of what the second question is talking about is a right wing in the context of American politics. You have anarcho-capitalist or even European, but Western. So, I mean, classical liberalism. Is there classical liberalism in the Philippines? That's another question. Yeah.
Can we provide preliminary answers to that question, just for starters? So what's your take or opinion on right-wing politics?
My take or opinion on right-wing politics, I think the important thing we have to do is to identify what does right-wing mean in the Philippines. I think even the term right-wing is derived from the French politics of the royal, like what is Orleanists?
I forgot.
Royalists.
Wait.
They're pro-monarchists, but basically they're people who
sat on the right
were
side
in favor of the old way of things. The old way, the traditional way. But these are not necessarily traditions of the Philippines. Small government. What do you mean by small government in the Philippines? I think when we say right wing in the Philippines, we mean traditionalists, and most people would refer to, the religious conservatives, and we do have big business here, but their political interests are not necessarily the same as the big business in America or in Europe. So there's particularities in there. Perhaps we can begin as a skeleton, but perhaps we need to nuance them to fit this context.
Yeah.
So yeah,
that's fair.
And you?
For my case, well, I just to be clear on my ideological stance on right-wing politics. At this point, and I think I'm relatively more convinced about this one, I do favor small governments, small and strong governments. The size of a government need not mean that it is It is not
Small
strong.
but strong.
It's small but strong government.
Like a donkey.
Yeah. And I'm also for the free market. I'm for the free market filled with worker-owned enterprises. That's my take. So it's a heterodox. I will not fit in any political compass with that idea.
Right.
So it's a heterodox. So free market filled with worker-owned enterprises. That's my idea.
Right.
With a small government who doesn't bother people.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But I think this is the perfect time to introduce that our next few episodes will be focusing on specific ideological positions, ideologies,
tendencies.
people that have expressed these tendencies. In a way, we've chosen people who, in a way, try to represent explicitly these. So we're going to interview conservatives, liberals, progressives, feminists,
social democrats,
even.
Anarchists.
So these are some of our friends and people who we have observed for a long time. So look out for that. This will be the main project of the PI podcast for the next few episodes, trying to identify these positions in the Philippine context. So that's interesting. So watch out for that. There's a PI ideological series, political ideologies.
Political ideology. Yeah, it's high time.
So that's a preliminary answer. What do you mean by right wing? I think that'll be the very next episode, and we'll watch out for that episode. So thank you very much for your questions. Thank you, Borj, for the answers. But again, this is a long conversation. It's a long-term project, not only in our podcast, but we've actually been writing about ideology. So look out for that. We'll be posting some of the sources that we've been talking about. You can look at the political spectrum and the political compass. You can even look at the definitions and sources cited by Borj. Yes. So, but keep reading and keep discussing, keep asking questions. If you want to ask more questions, feel free to send us an email at pipodcastph@gmail.com, no spaces, lowercase, and feel free to send us a message at our Facebook page. You can also comment on YouTube, and I believe you can also comment on Anchor. But so that's a new thing, I think. We'll explore that. But until the next episode,
magandang gabi, mga ka-PI.